Welcome back to the Midnight Library. Tonight, we're settling into one of the most consequential chapters in American history. A story of division, courage, suffering, and transformation that forever changed not just one nation, but sent ripples across the entire world. This is the complete story of the American Civil War, told slowly, carefully, and in full detail. A conflict that began long before the first shots were fired, and whose echoes still resonate through the present day. The American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865. 4 years that felt like an eternity. More than 600,000 soldiers died, though some modern estimates push that number closer to 750,000 when accounting for disease, starvation, and missing casualties. To put that in perspective, that's more American deaths than all other American wars combined, from the Revolution through the Korean War. Towns were destroyed, economies collapsed, families were torn apart, and an entire way of life built on the enslavement of millions of human beings finally came to an end. But to understand how America reached this breaking point, we need to go back much further. We need to understand how a nation founded on principles of liberty and equality could simultaneously embrace the brutal institution of slavery. How economic systems, political compromises, and deeply held beliefs about race and power created fault lines that would eventually split the country in two. So tonight, we'll trace this story from its earliest origins, through the growing tensions of the 1800s, into the war itself, and finally into the difficult decades of Reconstruction that followed. Make yourself comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Settle into the quietness of this hour. The story we're about to explore together is long and winding, filled with names and dates, battles and speeches, moments of extraordinary heroism and unfathomable cruelty. But it's a story worth knowing, worth understanding in its full complexity. Because the American Civil War wasn't just about the past. It shaped the nation that exists today, and its lessons continue to matter. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives into history, these calm explorations of the past designed to help you learn while you drift towards sleep, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find these stories. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what aspect of Civil War history interests you most. Now then, let's dim the lights, let the outside world fade away, and step back in time. Back to the very beginning, to understand how the seeds of this great conflict were planted long before anyone imagined brother would fight against brother on American soil. The story begins not in 1861, but more than 2 centuries earlier, in 1619, when the first enslaved Africans arrived in the English colony of Virginia. 20 or so individuals, captured from their homeland, transporting across the Atlantic Ocean in conditions of unimaginable horror and sold as property in the New World. This wasn't the beginning of slavery in the Americas. The Spanish and Portuguese had been enslaving indigenous peoples and Africans for more than a century. But it marked the beginning of slavery in what would become the United States. At first, the status of these Africans in Virginia was somewhat ambiguous. The colony already had indentured servants, mostly poor Europeans who worked for a set number of years to pay off their passage to America. Some early African arrivals may have had similar arrangements, but within a generation, colonial laws began to harden racial lines. By the 1660s and 1670s, Virginia and other colonies were passing laws that specifically defined slavery as a permanent, hereditary condition tied to African ancestry. Children born to enslaved mothers would be enslaved themselves, regardless of who their father was. Slavery was becoming not just an economic system, but a racial caste system. Why did this happen? Economics played a massive role. Growing tobacco, and later rice, indigo and cotton, required enormous amounts of labor. Landowners wanted workers they could control completely, workers who couldn't leave after a few years like indentured servants could. Enslaved Africans, torn from their homeland with no legal rights, no knowledge of the terrain, and marked by their skin color in a way that made escape nearly impossible, became the solution to the labor problem. Over the next century, hundreds of thousands of Africans were brought to North America in chains. By the time of the American Revolution, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, though it was far more economically central in the South than the North. The Revolutionary War created a profound contradiction. American colonists declared their independence from Britain with soaring rhetoric about natural rights and human equality. The Declaration of Independence, pennied by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, proclaimed that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were revolutionary ideas, genuinely transformative for their time. But Jefferson himself owned more than 600 enslaved people over his lifetime. Many of the other founding fathers were also slaveholders. The beautiful words of the Declaration applied, in practice, only to white men. Some Americans recognized this hypocrisy immediately. Abolitionist movements existed even during the Revolution. Quakers and other religious groups argued that slavery was sinful and incompatible with Christian values. Some veterans who had fought for American liberty questioned how they could keep other human beings in bondage. In the northern states, where slavery was less economically important, gradual emancipation began. Vermont abolished slavery in 1777. Pennsylvania passed a gradual emancipation law in 1780. Massachusetts effectively ended slavery through court decisions in the 1780s. New York and New Jersey followed with gradual emancipation laws in the early 1800s. But the South moved in the opposite direction. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney made cotton production vastly more profitable. Before the cotton gin, separating cotton fibers from seeds was labor-intensive and time-consuming, which limited cotton cultivation. The cotton gin mechanized this process, making cotton a phenomenally lucrative crop. Suddenly, vast plantations could produce enormous quantities of cotton for textile mills in Britain and the northern United States. And cotton cultivation, much like tobacco, required massive amounts of labor. Slavery, far from gradually dying out as some had hoped, became more entrenched and more brutal. When the Constitution was drafted in 1787, slavery became one of the most contentious issues. Northern delegates wanted to limit or eliminate it. Southern delegates insisted that their states would never join the Union if slavery was restricted. The result was a series of compromises that embedded slavery into the nation's founding document without ever actually using the word slave. The 3/5 compromise counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation in Congress. This gave Southern states more political power than their free population alone would warrant, since they gained extra representatives based on people who couldn't vote and had no rights. The Constitution also included a fugitive slave clause, requiring that people who escaped slavery be returned to their enslavers even if they reached free states. And it prohibited Congress from banning the international slave trade until 1808, giving the institution 20 more years of importing human beings from Africa. These compromises allowed the Constitution to be ratified and the new nation to form. But they also built slavery's protection into the very structure of American government. The United States was founded, from its beginning, as a house divided, half slave, half free. And though many hoped this division would resolve itself peacefully over time, the opposite occurred. The divisions deepened. The early decades of the 1800s saw rapid westward expansion. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the United States overnight. New territories meant new states, and every time a new state prepared to enter the Union, the same explosive question arose. Would it be a free state or a slave state? This wasn't just about morality or economics for individual states. It was about the balance of power in the Senate, because each state, regardless of size, received 2 senators. The slave states and free states were locked in a political struggle. If free states gained more senators, they could potentially pass laws restricting or even abolishing slavery. If slave states gained more senators, they could protect and expand the institution. Every new state shifted this balance, making statehood debates intensely political and increasingly bitter. The first major crisis came in 1819 when Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state. At the time, the Union had 11 free states and 11 slave states, maintaining perfect balance in the Senate. Missouri's admission would tip the scales. Northern congressmen proposed amendments to gradually abolish slavery in Missouri. Southern congressmen viewed this as an attack on their rights and way of life. The debate grew so heated that Thomas Jefferson, in retirement, wrote that it awakened him like a fire bell in the night, filling him with terror for the future of the nation. The crisis was resolved, temporarily, with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri entered as a slave state, but to maintain balance, Maine separated from Massachusetts and entered as a free state. More importantly, the compromise drew a line across the Louisiana Territory at latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. North of that line, except for Missouri itself, slavery would be prohibited in any future states. South of that line, slavery would be permitted. It was a geographical solution to a moral and political problem, kicking the fundamental question down the road while pretending to resolve it. For about a generation, the Missouri Compromise held. But it was an uneasy peace, and beneath the surface, the tensions continued to build. The economies of North and South were diverging. The North was industrializing, building factories and railroads, attracting waves of European immigrants to work in mills and mines. Cities grew. A middle class emerged. The economy became increasingly diverse and interconnected. Northern states developed public education systems and invested in infrastructure. The South remained overwhelmingly agricultural, its economy dependent on a few cash crops, especially cotton. The plantation system concentrated wealth in the hands of a small elite. These plantation owners, though a minority of the white Southern population, wielded enormous political and social power. They controlled most of the wealth, most of the land, and most of the enslaved labor. Poor white farmers, who owned no enslaved people, occupied a complicated position in this society. They had little economic power, but Southern elites cultivated their loyalty by emphasizing white supremacy. As long as even the poorest white man stood above any black person, enslaved or free, the system could maintain itself. By 1830, there were more than 2 million enslaved people in the United States. They worked primarily in the South, on plantations growing cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. Their lives were characterized by brutality, family separation, and the constant threat of violence. Enslaved people had no legal rights. They couldn't marry legally, own property, or testify in court. They could be bought, sold, beaten, raped, or killed with minimal legal consequence to their enslavers. Families were routinely torn apart when individuals were sold to different owners. Children were separated from parents, husbands from wives. And yet, despite this unimaginable oppression, enslaved people created communities, maintained African cultural traditions, formed families, practiced religion, and resisted their bondage in countless ways. Some resistance was subtle, working slowly, breaking tools, feigning illness. Some was cultural, preserving songs, stories, and spiritual practices that sustained hope. Some was open rebellion. In 1831, a deeply religious enslaved man named Nat Turner led the most significant slave rebellion in American history. In Southampton County, Virginia, Turner and a group of followers killed approximately 60 white people over 2 days, moving from plantation to plantation. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, and Turner and many others were executed. The white response was swift and savage. Hundreds of black people, many of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion, were killed in retaliation. And across the South, slave codes became even more restrictive. Teaching enslaved people to read became illegal in most slave states. Movement was further restricted. The right to assemble was curtailed. Nat Turner's rebellion terrified white Southerners, confirming their deepest fears about the people they held in bondage. It also hardened attitudes. Before 1831, there had been some anti-slavery sentiment even in the South, particularly in the upper South states like Virginia. But after Turner's rebellion, Southern voices increasingly defended slavery not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good. Ministers used the Bible to justify it. Politicians argued it was essential to the economy. Pseudoscientific theories claimed black people were inferior and benefited from the supposedly civilizing influence of slavery. This intellectual and cultural defense of slavery grew stronger throughout the 1830s and 40s. Meanwhile, in the North, the abolitionist movement was gaining strength. William Lloyd Garrison began publishing The Liberator, an anti-slavery newspaper, in 1831. He demanded immediate emancipation, no gradual plans, no colonization schemes. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in 1838, became one of the most powerful voices for abolition. His autobiography, published in 1845, provided a first-hand account of slavery's horrors and demonstrated the intelligence and humanity of black people in ways that challenged racist assumptions. Other abolitionists organized petition campaigns, established underground railroad networks to help people escape slavery, and pushed for anti-slavery policies. The movement was diverse. Some abolitionists, like Garrison, were radical, calling for immediate emancipation and full equality. Others were more moderate, focusing on stopping slavery's expansion rather than ending it where it already existed. Some, motivated by religious conviction, saw slavery as a sin. Others, motivated by political principles, saw it as incompatible with Republican government. But even in the North, abolitionists were often a controversial minority. Many white Northerners were indifferent to slavery or actively hostile to black people themselves. Racism was pervasive nationwide, not just in the South. Northern states had their own discriminatory laws. Free black people in the North faced segregation, limited economic opportunities, and violence. So while the abolitionist movement grew, it should not be imagined as representing majority Northern opinion. Most white Northerners in the 1840s cared more about keeping slavery out of the territories where they might settle than about ending it in the South. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 dramatically intensified sectional tensions. The United States defeated Mexico and acquired vast territories in the Southwest, including what would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Once again, new territory raised the question, free or slave? A Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot introduced a proviso in 1846 that would have banned slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. The Wilmot proviso passed the House multiple times, but always failed in the Senate, where Southern states had more power. Even though it never became law, the Wilmot proviso revealed how divisive the slavery question had become. It wasn't just about morality anymore. It was about political power, economic systems, and competing visions of what America should be. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 brought tens of thousands of people rushing west, and California quickly sought statehood. But California wanted to enter as a free state, which would upset the balance in the Senate that had been carefully maintained since the Missouri Compromise. The nation faced another crisis. The result was the Compromise of 1850, a series of measures designed to satisfy both North and South. California entered as a free state, giving free states a majority in the Senate for the first time. In exchange, the territories of New Mexico and Utah would be organized without restrictions on slavery, allowing settlers to decide the issue for themselves through a principle called popular sovereignty. The slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, though slavery itself remained legal there. And critically, a new, much stricter Fugitive Slave Act was passed. This law required that escaped slaves be returned to their enslavers even if they reached free states. It denied accused runaways the right to a trial and imposed heavy fines on anyone who helped them. Federal commissioners were paid more if they ruled that someone was a fugitive slave than if they ruled the person was free, creating a financial incentive to support slaveholders. The law also required ordinary citizens in free states to assist in capturing alleged runaways if called upon. The Fugitive Slave Act enraged many Northerners. It brought slavery directly to their doorsteps, forcing them to participate in the system even in states where slavery was illegal. Free black people in the North, some of whom had never been enslaved, lived in fear of being kidnapped and sent south based on false claims. And for the first time, large numbers of white Northerners who had been indifferent to slavery felt personally implicated in it. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel depicting the cruelties of slavery. The book became an enormous bestseller, second only to the Bible in sales during the 19th century. Stowe's portrayal of slavery's brutality, particularly her depiction of enslaved families being separated, moved many readers who had previously been unmoved by abolitionist arguments. The novel was sentimental, sometimes stereotypical, but it made slavery real and personal for white Northerners. In the South, the book was banned in many places and provoked fury. Southerners accused Stowe of lying and distorting the supposedly benevolent nature of slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin changed the cultural landscape. When Abraham Lincoln met Stowe during the Civil War, he reportedly said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Whether he actually said that is uncertain, but it captures how significant the novel was in shaping public opinion. Then came 1854, and with it, one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas wanted to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to facilitate a transcontinental railroad through the region. But to gain Southern support, he proposed that popular sovereignty, letting settlers decide, would determine whether these territories allowed slavery. There was one major problem. Kansas and Nebraska were north of the 3630 line established by the Missouri Compromise, meaning they should have been free territory. Douglas's bill explicitly repealed that part of the Missouri Compromise, opening territories that had been designated as free for more than 30 years to the possibility of slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, but it shattered the fragile peace. It destroyed the Whig Party, which had tried to straddle the sectional divide, and gave birth to a new political party, the Republicans. The Republican Party formed specifically in opposition to slavery's expansion. It attracted former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, free soilers, and abolitionists. The party's core principle was that slavery must not expand into the territories. Some Republicans wanted to eventually abolish slavery everywhere. Others just wanted to contain it. But all agreed it should not spread. And in Kansas, the policy of popular sovereignty led to violence. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas, each side hoping to win the majority and control the territory's future. Pro-slavery Missourians, called border ruffians, crossed into Kansas to vote illegally in elections and intimidate Free State settlers. Anti-slavery settlers established their own towns and governments. Soon, armed conflict broke out. Towns were burned. People were killed. The territory became known as Bleeding Kansas, a preview of the larger Civil War to come. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in 1856 when abolitionist John Brown and his sons killed 5 pro-slavery settlers at Potawatomi Creek in retaliation for earlier violence against Free State settlers. John Brown was a deeply religious man who believed he was chosen by God to strike down slavery. His actions in Kansas made him a hero to some abolitionists and a terrorist to others. He would return to national attention 3 years later. Even in Congress, violence erupted. In May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a fiery speech called "The Crime Against Kansas," attacking slavery and mocking several Southern senators, including Andrew Butler of South Carolina. 2 days later, Representative Preston Brooks, Butler's cousin, entered the Senate chamber and beat Sumner nearly to death with a cane. Sumner suffered severe injuries and took 3 years to recover enough to return to the Senate. Brooks became a hero in the South, receiving dozens of new canes from supporters. The incident showed how thoroughly civility had broken down. In 1857, the Supreme Court delivered one of its most disastrous decisions in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott was an enslaved man whose enslaver had taken him to live in free states and territories for years before returning to Missouri. Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that living in free territory had made him free. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger Taney, in a 7-2 decision, ruled against Scott, but Taney went much further than simply deciding the case. He declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, could never be citizens of the United States. They had, he wrote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Furthermore, Taney ruled that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, meaning the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional all along. The Dred Scott decision was a catastrophe for anti-slavery forces. It suggested that slavery could not be legally restricted anywhere, that it might even spread to free states. Republicans denounced the decision, and it became a rallying point for the party. Abraham Lincoln, then a lawyer in Illinois, gave speeches arguing that the decision was wrongly decided and should not be accepted as binding precedent. He warned that the next step would be a Supreme Court decision making slavery legal even in free states. In 1858, Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas for his Senate seat in Illinois. The two men engaged in a series of 7 debates across the state, discussing slavery, popular sovereignty, and the future of the nation. The debates were extraordinarily substantive, with each man speaking for hours, addressing complex constitutional and moral questions. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, arguing that each territory should decide for itself whether to allow slavery. He claimed not to care whether slavery was voted up or down, that it was a local question. Lincoln argued that slavery was morally wrong and must not be allowed to spread. He didn't advocate for immediate abolition in the South, but insisted that the nation acknowledge slavery as wrong and take steps toward its eventual extinction. At the Freeport debate, Lincoln posed a question that put Douglas in an impossible position. Could the people of a territory legally exclude slavery before becoming a state, despite the Dred Scott decision? Douglas answered yes, through popular sovereignty, but this alienated Southern Democrats who believed slavery was a constitutional right that could not be voted away. Lincoln lost the Senate election, but the debates made him a national figure and positioned him for a presidential run. In October 1859, John Brown launched his most audacious action. With a small group of followers, both black and white, he seized the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was to capture weapons, arm enslaved people, and ignite a widespread slave rebellion. The plan failed almost immediately. Local militia surrounded Brown's group. Federal troops led by Colonel Robert E. Lee stormed the armory. Several of Brown's men were killed, and Brown himself was captured, tried for treason, and hanged in December. Brown's raid terrified the South. It seemed to confirm their worst fears that abolitionists wanted to incite bloody slave revolts. In the North, opinions were divided. Many condemned Brown's violence, but others praised his courage and commitment. On the day of his execution, church bells tolled in northern cities, and some considered him a martyr. His final words predicted that the crimes of the nation could only be purged with blood, a prophecy that would prove tragically accurate. The presidential election of 1860 took place in this atmosphere of crisis and division. The Democratic Party, which had managed to remain a national party by avoiding firm positions on slavery, finally split along sectional lines. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas on a platform of popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky on a platform supporting slavery's expansion. A fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell and tried to avoid the slavery issue entirely, calling only for preservation of the Union. The Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a moderate by Republican standards. He opposed slavery's expansion, but promised not to interfere with it where it already existed. He supported the Fugitive Slave Act, though he found it distasteful. Explicitly stated, he had no intention of granting social or political equality to black people, though he insisted they had natural rights. His position was designed to hold together the diverse coalition of Republicans while appealing to moderate Northerners. Because of the four-way race, Lincoln won the presidency with only about 40% of the popular vote. He didn't win a single Southern state and wasn't even on the ballot in most of them. His victory was entirely Northern and Western. But in the Electoral College, he won decisively. For many white Southerners, Lincoln's election was the final straw. They believed that a Republican president, even a moderate one, would eventually move to restrict and destroy slavery. They saw the election as proof that the North was using its growing population to dominate the South politically, and they decided they would no longer remain in a union where they lacked the power to protect their interests, which fundamentally meant protecting slavery. South Carolina acted first. On December 20th, 1860, a special convention voted unanimously to secede from the United States. The state issued a declaration of the immediate causes, which made clear that slavery was the central reason. The declaration complained that northern states had failed to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, that they had allowed anti-slavery agitation, and that they had elected a president hostile to slavery. Other Deep South states quickly followed. Mississippi seceded in January 1861, followed by Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Each state issued similar declarations citing threats to slavery as the reason for secession. In February, delegates from these states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. The Confederates wrote their own constitution, closely modeled on the U.S. Constitution, but with key differences. It explicitly protected slavery, prohibiting any law that would deny the right to own enslaved people. It emphasized states' rights and limited the central government's power in some ways, though it also made the president's term 6 years and gave the president a line-item veto. The Confederate Constitution revealed what the secession was fundamentally about. This was not primarily about tariffs or abstract principles of state sovereignty. It was about preserving and protecting slavery. On February 9th, the Confederate Congress elected Jefferson Davis as provisional president. Davis was a West Point graduate, a Mexican War veteran, and a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War. He was a slaveholder who had opposed immediate secession, but accepted it once Mississippi left the Union. In his inaugural address, Davis emphasized that the Confederacy simply wanted to be left alone, to govern themselves according to their own principles. By the time Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, 7 states had left the Union. The question was whether the remaining slave states, the Upper South and border states, would join them. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri all still remained in the Union, though their loyalties were uncertain. Lincoln's first inaugural address tried to walk an impossible line. He reassured Southerners that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed. He promised to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, but he also firmly stated that secession was illegal, that the Union was perpetual and could not be dissolved. He said he would hold federal property in the South and collect federal taxes, and he closed with an eloquent appeal. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." The bonds of affection had already broken, and within weeks, the nation would be at war. The immediate crisis centered on Fort Sumter, a federal military installation in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. When South Carolina seceded, it demanded that federal troops evacuate all forts in the state. President James Buchanan, still in office during the secession crisis, refused to surrender the forts, but also did nothing to reinforce them, essentially paralyzed by indecision. By the time Lincoln took office, most federal installations in the South had been seized by Confederate forces. Fort Sumter remained one of the few still under Union control. The fort was commanded by Major Robert Anderson, a Kentucky-born officer who had actually been a slaveholder but remained loyal to the United States. Anderson and his small garrison of fewer than 90 men were running low on supplies. Lincoln faced a terrible dilemma. If he resupplied the fort, it might provoke the Confederacy into starting a war. If he abandoned it, he would be accepting Confederate independence and encouraging the other slave states to secede as well. Lincoln decided on a middle course. He would send supplies to the fort, but only food and provisions, not weapons or reinforcements, and he would inform South Carolina's governor in advance. This was a carefully calculated move. If the Confederates allowed the supplies through, the Union maintained its presence. If they attacked, the Confederacy would be firing the first shots, making them the aggressors. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet debated their response. They knew that allowing the fort to be resupplied would undermine their claim to independence. On April 10, 1861, Davis ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard, commanding Confederate forces in Charleston, to demand Fort Sumter's surrender. Anderson refused. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment continued for 34 hours. Anderson's men returned fire but were vastly outgunned. The fort's walls were battered, fires broke out, and the situation became hopeless. Remarkably, no one on either side was killed during the actual bombardment, though 2 Union soldiers died in an accidental explosion during the surrender ceremony. On April 13th, Anderson agreed to evacuate. He and his men were allowed to leave with full military honors, and they sailed north. The Confederate flag now flew over Fort Sumter. The war had begun. News of Fort Sumter's fall electrified both North and South. In the Confederacy, there was celebration, confidence that the Yankees would never fight, or if they did, would be quickly defeated. Young men rushed to enlist, afraid the war would end before they could participate in what they imagined would be a brief, glorious adventure. In the North, the attack on Fort Sumter unified public opinion in ways that years of political debate had not. Even many Democrats who had opposed Lincoln rallied to support the Union. Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's old rival, met with the president and pledged his support. The attack on a federal fort was seen as rebellion and treason, and Northerners who cared little about slavery still cared deeply about preserving the Union their grandfathers had fought to create. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 militia volunteers to serve for 90 days to suppress the rebellion. 90 days. That's how long people thought this would take. How tragically wrong they were. The call for troops forced the upper South states to make their choice. Lincoln was asking them to provide soldiers to fight against other Southern states. Virginia, the most populous and influential Southern state, had remained in the Union through the secession crisis. But when asked to send troops against the Confederacy, Virginia's convention voted to secede on April 17th. Virginia's decision was momentous. It brought enormous resources, population, and military talent to the Confederacy, and it made Richmond, Virginia's capital, the new Confederate capital. Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee followed Virginia out of the Union. The Confederacy now had 11 states, but critically, 4 slave states remained in the Union: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. These border states became crucial battlegrounds, not always in military terms, but certainly in political terms. Lincoln had to maintain their loyalty while also managing the anti-slavery Republican base that wanted more aggressive action against slavery. Maryland's loyalty was especially vital because it surrounded Washington, D.C. on 3 sides. If Maryland seceded, the nation's capital would be trapped in Confederate territory. Pro-Confederate sentiment was strong in Maryland, especially in Baltimore. When Union troops from Massachusetts traveled through Baltimore in late April, they were attacked by a mob, resulting in the first deaths of the war: 4 soldiers and 12 civilians. Lincoln took aggressive action to keep Maryland in the Union, including suspending habeas corpus and arresting secessionist legislators. Maryland remained in the Union, but under duress. Kentucky declared neutrality, trying to avoid the war altogether. Both Union and Confederate governments initially respected this neutrality, knowing that whichever side violated it might push Kentucky to the other side. But neutrality couldn't last. By September 1861, both sides had troops in Kentucky, and it became another border state battleground. Missouri descended into guerrilla warfare. The state government was divided, with pro-Union and pro-Confederate factions. Regular armies fought there, but so did irregular forces, bushwhackers and jayhawkers, engaging in brutal raids and reprisals. Missouri sent men to fight for both sides, and civilians suffered tremendously throughout the war. By summer 1861, the lines were drawn. 23 states remained in the Union, with a population of about 22 million. 11 states formed the Confederacy, with a population of about 9 million, of whom nearly 4 million were enslaved. The Union had overwhelming advantages in population, industry, railroads, and naval power. The North produced more than 90% of the nation's manufactured goods. It had more than twice as many miles of railroad. Its navy could blockade southern ports, cutting off trade. But the Confederacy had advantages too. It was fighting a defensive war, which meant it didn't need to conquer the North, only to resist being conquered. Defensive wars are generally easier. The South had superior military leadership at the war's start. Many of the best officers in the old U.S. Army were Southerners who chose to fight for their home states. Robert E. Lee, the most talented officer in the Army, had been offered command of Union forces but resigned when Virginia seceded, choosing loyalty to his state over loyalty to his country. The Confederacy also had the advantage of fighting on home territory, with shorter supply lines and knowledge of the terrain. Southern soldiers believed they were defending their homes and families from invasion, which gave them powerful motivation. And Confederate leaders believed, probably correctly, that they didn't need to win decisively. They just needed to make the war so costly and prolonged that Northern public opinion would turn against it, and the Union would agree to let them go. In July 1861, public pressure mounted for the Union Army to advance on Richmond and end the rebellion quickly. General Irvin McDowell commanded about 35,000 Union troops near Washington. He knew his army was poorly trained and not ready for a major battle, but Lincoln and the public demanded action. The 90-day militia enlistments were expiring, and there was a sense that the war needed to be won now. McDowell marched his army south toward Manassas Junction, Virginia, where Confederate General Beauregard had positioned about 20,000 troops along a creek called Bull Run. The battle began on July 21st, 1861. At first, Union forces seemed to be winning, pushing back Confederate positions. Northern civilians, including congressmen and their families, rode out from Washington with picnic baskets to watch what they expected to be a glorious Union victory. Instead, they witnessed disaster. Confederate reinforcements arrived by railroad, including a brigade commanded by General Thomas Jackson. When Confederate forces began to waver under Union assault, another general reportedly shouted, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall." Jackson earned his famous nickname, Stonewall, in that moment, though there's debate about whether the comment was admiration or criticism. As the day wore on, fresh Confederate troops turned the battle. Union forces, exhausted and disorganized, began to retreat. The retreat turned into a rout. Soldiers fled in panic, clogging the roads back to Washington, along with the horrified civilians who had come to watch. McDowell's army essentially disintegrated. The Confederates were too disorganized themselves to pursue effectively, but they had won a stunning victory. The Battle of Bull Run, called First Manassas in the South, shattered Northern illusions that the war would be short and easy. Nearly 5,000 total casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, shocked a nation that hadn't fought a major war in decades. The defeat humiliated the Union and energized the Confederacy. Southern newspapers crowed that one Southern man could whip 10 Yankees. Confidence soared that European powers, especially Britain, would recognize Confederate independence. But First Bull Run also had a sobering effect. In the North, it became clear that winning would require a real army, real training, and real commitment. Lincoln called for 300,000 volunteers to serve 3-year terms, and he brought in a new commander for what would become the Army of the Potomac, General George B. McClellan. McClellan was 34 years old, a West Point graduate who had distinguished himself in the Mexican War and then left the army for a successful business career before the war brought him back. He was an excellent organizer and trainer. He transformed a mob into an army, drilling the troops, establishing discipline, creating supply systems. The soldiers loved him. He had charisma and confidence. He also had profound flaws as a commander. McClellan was overly cautious, constantly overestimating enemy numbers and hesitating to commit to battle. He had political ambitions and saw Lincoln as an inferior. A Democrat who opposed emancipation, McClellan wanted to fight a limited war that would restore the Union without fundamentally changing Southern society. His relationship with Lincoln grew increasingly strained. Through late 1861 and into 1862, McClellan trained his army but refused to advance. Lincoln grew frustrated. "If General McClellan does not want to use the army," Lincoln reportedly said, "I would like to borrow it." Public pressure mounted for action. Finally, in spring 1862, McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign. Rather than marching directly south toward Richmond, McClellan's plan was to transport his army by ship to the Virginia Peninsula between the York and James Rivers, then advance on Richmond from the southeast. It was an ambitious plan requiring complex logistics. By early April 1862, McClellan had landed over 100,000 men on the peninsula, beginning a slow advance toward Richmond. The Peninsular Campaign revealed McClellan's weaknesses. He moved cautiously, always convinced he was outnumbered. At Yorktown, he spent a month besieging Confederate fortifications that were actually weakly held. The Confederates used this time to strengthen Richmond's defenses and bring in reinforcements. When the Union Army finally reached the outskirts of Richmond in late May, they were within sight of the city's church spires. The Confederate commander, General Joseph Johnston, attacked McClellan's army at the Battle of Seven Pines on May 31st, 1862. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but had enormous consequences. Johnston was seriously wounded, and President Davis replaced him with Robert E. Lee. Lee's appointment changed everything. At 55, Lee was the son of a Revolutionary War hero, a distinguished career officer, and a Virginia aristocrat. He was courteous, deeply religious, and had opposed secession initially. But when Virginia left the Union, Lee resigned his commission and offered his services to the Confederacy. Davis had been using Lee as a military advisor, but now gave him field command, naming his force the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee immediately began planning an offensive. He brought in Stonewall Jackson's forces from the Shenandoah Valley, where Jackson had been conducting a brilliant campaign that tied down far larger Union forces. In late June 1862, Lee launched a series of attacks known as the 7 Days Battles. Fighting raged from June 25 through July 1st at battles with names like Mechanicsville, Gaines Mill, and Malvern Hill. The 7 days were tactically costly for Lee. Confederate casualties were significantly higher than Union casualties, but strategically, Lee won a tremendous victory. McClellan, despite having a larger army, became convinced he was vastly outnumbered and retreated. The Peninsular Campaign, which had brought Union forces to Richmond's doorstep, ended with the Army of the Potomac back where it started, and McClellan blaming everyone but himself for the failure. The war in the West, meanwhile, was going better for the Union. The Confederacy's defensive line ran across Kentucky and Tennessee. Breaking this line was crucial to Union strategy, opening paths into the Confederate heartland. The man who would become the Union's greatest general was already emerging in this theater, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was an unlikely hero. He had graduated from West Point, but without distinction. He served in the Mexican War, then resigned from the army in 1854 amid rumors of drinking problems. By 1861, he was working in his family's leather shop in Illinois, seemingly a failure at age 39. When war came, he rejoined the army and received command of volunteers. In February 1862, Grant captured Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and then Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. Fort Donelson's commander asked for terms. Grant's response became famous. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. The newspapers dubbed him Unconditional Surrender Grant. The victories opened Tennessee to Union invasion and made Grant a hero in the North. But Grant nearly lost his career at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnston launched a surprise attack on Grant's army camped near Pittsburg Landing, Tennessee. The first day of battle, April 6th, was a disaster for the Union. Confederate forces drove Grant's men back toward the Tennessee River in fierce fighting. Johnston was killed in the assault, one of the highest-ranking battlefield deaths of the war. By nightfall, the Union Army seemed on the verge of destruction, but Grant didn't panic. Reinforcements arrived overnight. On April 7th, Grant counterattacked, and the exhausted Confederate forces retreated. Shiloh was the bloodiest battle in American history up to that point, with more than 23,000 total casualties. The scale of slaughter shocked both sides. One officer wrote that the peach trees in the orchard, where much fighting occurred, bloomed with pink petals that fell like snow on the dead bodies lying beneath them. The site became known as the Peach Orchard, a place where beauty and death mingled in ways that would become grimly familiar as the war continued. Critics called for Grant to be removed, claiming he had been caught by surprise and was drunk. Lincoln refused. "I can't spare this man," Lincoln reportedly said. "He fights." Grant remained in command, and his aggressiveness would eventually win the war. By summer 1862, Lincoln faced growing pressure on the slavery question. Radical Republicans in Congress were pushing for emancipation. They argued that slavery was the root cause of the war, that enslaved people were being used to support the Confederate war effort, and that freeing them was both morally right and militarily necessary. They had already pushed through the Confiscation Acts, which declared that enslaved people used by the Confederate military or owned by people in rebellion were free if they came into Union lines. Lincoln personally hated slavery and wanted to see it ended, but he had to balance multiple concerns. He needed to keep the border states in the Union. He worried about whether emancipation was constitutional, whether a president had the power to simply free millions of people who were legally considered property. And he knew that many white Northerners, especially Democrats, would oppose a war fought for abolition rather than simply for union. Lincoln tried to promote gradual, compensated emancipation, where the federal government would pay slaveholders to free enslaved people and support colonization plans to send freed people to Africa or elsewhere. Border state representatives rejected these plans. Abolitionists opposed colonization as racist and impractical. Lincoln was caught between groups pushing in opposite directions. By mid-1862, Lincoln had decided that emancipation was necessary. He drafted a preliminary proclamation, but waited for a military victory to announce it, fearing it would seem like an act of desperation if issued during a string of defeats. That victory came, barely, in September at Antietam. After driving McClellan away from Richmond, Robert E. Lee decided to invade the North. An invasion would take the war out of Virginia, allowing farmers to harvest crops without armies trampling them. It might encourage Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy, and it might influence Northern elections in favor of Democrats who wanted a negotiated peace. In early September 1862, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac into Maryland. He had about 40,000 men, and they were not an impressive sight. Many were barefoot, their uniforms in tatters, their stomachs empty, but they were confident, led by Lee and Jackson, and had beaten the Union Army repeatedly. McClellan, restored to command, moved to intercept Lee with about 75,000 men. Through extraordinary luck, Union soldiers found a copy of Lee's orders wrapped around 3 cigars, showing that Lee had divided his forces. McClellan had a chance to attack Lee's dispersed army piece by piece. But McClellan moved slowly as always, giving Lee time to concentrate his forces near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. The Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, became the bloodiest single day in American history. Nearly 23,000 casualties in 12 hours of fighting. The battle raged across farmers' fields with pastoral names that became synonymous with slaughter. The cornfield, the sunken road that became known as Bloody Lane, and Burnside's Bridge, where Union forces fought desperately to cross a narrow stone bridge. Neither side achieved a decisive victory, but Lee withdrew back into Virginia. McClellan claimed triumph, but failed to pursue Lee's battered army, letting them escape. Lincoln, frustrated with McClellan's overcaution, would eventually replace him. But Antietam was enough of a victory for Lincoln's purposes. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared that on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be forever free. It was carefully crafted. It didn't free enslaved people in the border states or in Confederate areas already under Union control, only in areas in rebellion. This meant it was issued as a war measure under the president's powers as commander-in-chief, not as a general abolition of slavery. The proclamation transformed the war. It made Union victory inseparable from slavery's end. It gave Union forces a clear moral purpose beyond simply restoring the previous status quo. It encouraged enslaved people to escape to Union lines and eventually allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army. And it made European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy virtually impossible. Britain had abolished slavery decades earlier, and British public opinion would not support aiding a slaveholding rebellion now that the war had become explicitly about freedom. The proclamation was controversial in the North. Democrats attacked it as unconstitutional and radical. Some Union soldiers, particularly in border units, were angry, saying they would fight for the Union but not for black freedom. But others embraced the new mission. Abolitionists celebrated. Frederick Douglass, who had been critical of Lincoln's cautiousness, praised the proclamation while continuing to push for fuller equality. True to his word, on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. The document was more of a legal text than an inspiring speech, carefully listing the specific parishes and counties where slavery was ended. But its impact was revolutionary. As Union armies advanced, they brought freedom. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people escaped to Union lines, undermining the Confederate economy and strengthening the Union cause. The Emancipation Proclamation also opened the door for black military service. Free black men in the North had been trying to enlist since the war began, but had been turned away. Now, the Union began actively recruiting black soldiers. By the war's end, about 180,000 black men, most of them formerly enslaved, served in the Union Army, and another 20,000 served in the Navy. Black soldiers fought to prove themselves against widespread racism and skepticism about whether they would fight as well as white soldiers. They were paid less than white soldiers until Congress finally equalized pay in 1864. They faced unique dangers as the Confederacy refused to treat black soldiers as legitimate prisoners of war. Confederate policy called for captured black soldiers to be returned to slavery or executed, and there were several documented massacres of black troops trying to surrender. Despite these obstacles, black regiments distinguished themselves in battle. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, led by white officer Robert Goode Shaw, became famous for its assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July 1863. The attack failed with heavy casualties, including Shaw himself, but the courage displayed demolished myths about black soldiers' fighting ability. By the war's end, black troops had participated in nearly every major campaign, and their service became a powerful argument for citizenship and political rights. The year 1863 would become the war's turning point, though no one knew it at the time. The armies had grown more professional, more deadly. What had begun as a conflict fought with antiquated tactics was evolving into modern warfare. Rifles with longer range and greater accuracy made the old Napoleonic tactics of massed infantry charges suicidal. Trenches, field fortifications, and defensive warfare began to dominate. In December 1862, Lincoln had replaced McClellan with General Ambrose Burnside, who, despite his self-professed lack of qualification, accepted command. Burnside immediately marched the Army of the Potomac toward Richmond again, this time planning to cross the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg, Virginia. Lee's army waited on the high ground beyond the town. On December 13, 1862, Burnside ordered repeated frontal assaults against the Confederate positions on Mayorise Heights. It was slaughter. Union soldiers advanced across open ground toward a stone wall where Confederate infantry waited, supported by artillery. Wave after wave of Union troops fell. Over 12,000 Union casualties compared to about 5,000 Confederate. One Confederate officer, watching the futile assaults, remarked that, "It is well that war is so terrible, otherwise we would grow too fond of it." Fredericksburg was a disaster that accomplished nothing except filling hospitals and graveyards. Burnside was replaced by General Joseph Hooker. Hooker, called Fighting Joe, had a better plan. In late April 1863, he maneuvered most of his army around Lee's flank, crossing the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers to approach Lee from the west, while leaving forces at Fredericksburg to pin Lee in place. It was well conceived, and Hooker had nearly 130,000 men against Lee's 60,000. But Lee and Jackson executed a brilliant countermove. Leaving a small force at Fredericksburg, Lee marched west to meet Hooker near a crossroads called Chancellorsville. Then, in an audacious move, Lee divided his already outnumbered army. He sent Stonewall Jackson with about 30,000 men on a long march around Hooker's right flank. On the evening of May 2nd, 1863, Jackson's force emerged from the woods and smashed into the Union flank, routing an entire corps. The Battle of Chancellorsville continued for several more days, but Hooker, despite his numerical advantage, was outfought and outmaneuvered. He withdrew across the Rappahannock. Lee had won another stunning victory. It was his greatest triumph, a masterpiece of military audacity, but it came at a terrible cost. After the flank attack, Jackson and some staff officers were riding back to Confederate lines in the darkness when they were mistaken for Union cavalry. Confederate soldiers opened fire, hitting Jackson 3 times. His left arm was amputated, and for a few days it seemed he might recover. Lee sent a message. "Tell General Jackson that I am sure he will recover. Give him my affectionate regards, and tell him to make haste and get well and come back to me as soon as he can. He has lost his left arm, but I'm my right." Jackson didn't recover. He developed pneumonia and died on May 10th, 1863. His last words, whispered in delirium, were, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." His death was a devastating loss for the Confederacy. Jackson had been Lee's most trusted subordinate, a brilliant tactical commander who understood Lee's intentions instinctively. The two had worked together like parts of a single mind. Lee would never find another subordinate who could replace Jackson. Chancellorsville convinced Lee that his army was invincible, that they could accomplish anything. He decided to invade the North again, this time pushing deeper into Pennsylvania. An invasion would disrupt Union plans, take the war away from Virginia again, allow his army to gather supplies from untouched northern farms, and might even threaten Washington or Philadelphia. Lee hoped a major victory on northern soil would finally break Union will to continue the war. In June 1863, the Army of Northern Virginia, about 75,000 men, marched north through the Shenandoah Valley and into Maryland and Pennsylvania. The Army of the Potomac, now commanded by General George Meade, who had just replaced Hooker days earlier, moved parallel, staying between Lee and Washington. Neither army intended to fight at Gettysburg. It was simply a crossroads town in south-central Pennsylvania. But advance units from both armies converged there on June 30th and July 1st, 1863, and the battle began almost accidentally. Confederate forces initially pushed Union forces back through the town, but Union troops occupied strong defensive positions on Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and 2 rocky hills called Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Over the next 2 days, Lee ordered attacks on both Union flanks, trying to break Meade's position. On July 2nd, fighting raged around Devil's Den, the wheat field, and the peach orchard. Union forces barely held Little Round Top in desperate fighting that included a famous bayonet charge by the 20th Maine Infantry under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. If Little Round Top had fallen, the entire Union position might have collapsed. On July 3rd, Lee ordered a massive frontal assault on the center of the Union line. About 12,500 Confederate soldiers, commanded by General George Pickett and others, would march across nearly a mile of open ground towards Cemetery Ridge. Before the attack, Confederate artillery bombarded the Union positions for nearly 2 hours, the largest artillery barrage of the war. Then, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate infantry emerged from the woods along Seminary Ridge. They formed long, perfectly dressed lines, battle flags flying, officers on horseback. It was a magnificent, terrible sight. Thousands of men in grey and button-up marching in formation across open farmland toward the Union positions on Cemetery Ridge. Union artillery opened fire immediately. Solid shot, and then canister rounds tore gaps in the Confederate lines. Men fell by the dozens, by the hundreds, but the survivors closed ranks and kept advancing. As they came within rifle range, Union infantry behind stone walls and field fortifications began firing in disciplined volleys. The carnage was indescribable. Confederate soldiers stumbled through the killing field, some running, others walking steadily forward into the storm of lead and iron. A few hundred Confederates, led by General Lewis Armistead, actually reached the Union line at a spot that became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Armistead, his hat on his sword to mark their target, led his men over a stone wall and into fierce hand-to-hand combat. Armistead fell mortally wounded within moments. The brief penetration of the Union line was quickly overwhelmed. Federal reinforcements rushed to the breach, and the Confederate attack collapsed. What became known as Pickett's charge had lasted less than an hour. Of the approximately 12,500 men who made the assault, nearly half became casualties. About 6,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. Survivors staggered back across the fields they had crossed with such discipline just an hour before. The attack had failed completely, and Lee's invasion of the North was finished. As the shattered remnants of the assault force returned, Lee rode among them, repeating, "It is all my fault." He prepared for a Union counterattack that never came. Meade, cautious like so many Union commanders before him, did not pursue. On the night of July 4th, in pouring rain, Lee's army began the long retreat back to Virginia. They carried with them thousands of wounded in wagons that stretched for miles, a procession of agony moving slowly through the mud. The Battle of Gettysburg was the largest battle ever fought in North America. Casualties totaled between 46,000 and 51,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Union losses were approximately 23,000. Confederate losses were probably around 28,000, though exact numbers are uncertain. The town of Gettysburg, with a population of about 2,400, was overwhelmed by the aftermath. Homes, churches, barns, and public buildings became hospitals. More than 5,000 dead horses and mules littered the battlefield. The smell was overwhelming. Citizens and soldiers worked for weeks to bury the dead. The battle was a turning point. Lee's army had suffered losses it could never fully replace. The invasion had failed. The hoped-for victory on northern soil that might have broken Union will and secured foreign recognition had not materialized. The Confederacy would never again mount a major offensive in the East. From Gettysburg onward, Lee would fight a defensive war, trying to hold out long enough for Northern public opinion to turn against continuing the conflict. And on the same day that Lee began his retreat from Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863, another Confederate disaster unfolded 1,000 miles to the west. After a brilliant campaign, Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, giving the Union complete control of the Mississippi River. Vicksburg was called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. The city sat on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, its fortifications making it nearly impregnable from direct assault. Controlling Vicksburg meant controlling the river, which was vital for Confederate supply lines and communication between the eastern and western parts of the Confederacy. Lincoln understood this. "Vicksburg is the key," he said. "The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." Grant had spent months trying to approach Vicksburg, experimenting with different routes through the swamps and bayous of the Mississippi Delta. Winter rains turned the landscape into a muddy quagmire. One attempt after another failed. Northern newspapers and politicians called for Grant's removal, claiming he was incompetent or drunk. But Lincoln stood by him. In April 1863, Grant made a daring move. He marched his army down the west bank of the Mississippi, while Admiral David Porter's gunboats and transports ran past Vicksburg's batteries at night. Despite heavy fire, most of the vessels made it through. Grant then crossed the river south of Vicksburg, landing his army deep in Confederate territory, cutting his own supply lines and living off the land. Confederate General John Pemberton, commanding Vicksburg's garrison, expected Grant to attack the city from the south. Instead, Grant marched northeast toward Jackson, the Mississippi state capital. In a brilliant campaign lasting just over 2 weeks, Grant's army fought and won 5 battles, captured Jackson, defeated a Confederate relief force, and then turned west to attack Vicksburg from the rear. Grant tried 2 direct assaults on Vicksburg's fortifications in mid-May. Both failed with heavy casualties. Grant then settled into a siege, surrounding the city and cutting it off from supplies. Confederate soldiers and Vicksburg civilians, trapped in the city, began to starve. They dug caves in the hillsides to shelter from constant Union bombardment. Rations dwindled until people were eating mules, horses, and rats. The siege lasted 47 days. On July 3rd, as Pickett's men charged at Gettysburg, Pemberton met with Grant to discuss surrender terms. Grant initially demanded unconditional surrender, but then agreed to parole the Confederate garrison rather than taking them prisoner, which would have created logistical problems. On July 4th, Pemberton formally surrendered. Nearly 30,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms. The capture of Vicksburg split the Confederacy in 2. Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were cut off from the rest of the South. The Mississippi River was now under Union control from its source to the Gulf of Mexico. Lincoln wrote, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Combined with the victory at Gettysburg, the fall of Vicksburg marked a fundamental shift in the war's momentum. 4 months after the battle, on November 19, 1863, a ceremony was held to dedicate a national cemetery at Gettysburg. The main speaker was Edward Everett, a renowned orator who spoke for 2 hours. President Lincoln was invited to make a few appropriate remarks. His speech lasted about 2 minutes. It consisted of just 272 words. The Gettysburg Address has become one of the most famous speeches in American history. Lincoln did not recount the battle or praise specific generals. Instead, he spoke about the meaning of the war and the nation's founding principles. 407 years ago, he began, dating the nation's birth to the Declaration of Independence in 1776, not the Constitution in 1787. This was significant. The Declaration proclaimed that all men are created equal, a principle the Constitution had compromised on. Lincoln reframed the war as a test of whether a nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, could survive. He honored the dead by calling for the living to complete their unfinished work, to ensure that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address redefined the war's purpose. It wasn't just about preserving the Union as it had been, but about creating a new birth of freedom, fulfilling the Declaration's promise of equality. It was a vision of America transformed by the war, not simply restored. But the war was far from over. While Union fortunes had improved dramatically in the second half of 1863, the Confederacy remained defiant. Lee's army, though battered, was still dangerous. In the West, Confederate forces contested Union advances, and the border states and Confederate-held territories faced brutal guerrilla warfare where neighbor fought neighbor in vicious raids. In Tennessee, the war raged on. After Vicksburg fell, Union forces moved to capture Chattanooga, a vital railroad junction that would open the way to Atlanta and the Deep South. In September 1863, Union General William Rosecrans maneuvered Confederate General Braxton Bragg out of Chattanooga without a major battle. But Bragg, reinforced by troops from Lee's army, including General James Longstreet, counterattacked. The Battle of Chickamauga, fought September 19th and 20th, 1863, in the forests of northern Georgia, was a Confederate victory and one of the war's bloodiest battles. Through a combination of luck and skill, Confederate forces broke the Union line. Most of Rosecrans's army retreated in disorder back to Chattanooga. Only a fierce stand by Union General George Thomas, who earned the nickname Rock of Chickamauga, prevented complete disaster. Thomas's men held a defensive position on Horseshoe Ridge, buying time for the army to escape. Casualties totaled about 34,000, roughly evenly split between the two sides. But Bragg failed to exploit his victory. Instead of pursuing and destroying Rosecrans's army, he besieged Chattanooga, occupying the heights around the city and cutting Union supply lines. Union forces in Chattanooga faced starvation. Horses died by the thousands. Soldiers went on quarter rations. Lincoln responded by sending Grant to take overall command in the West and by rushing reinforcements from Virginia and elsewhere. Grant arrived in Chattanooga in late October, replacing Rosecrans with Thomas. Grant immediately worked to open a supply line, the Cracker Line, bringing food and ammunition into the besieged city. In late November, Grant ordered an offensive to break the siege. On November 24th, Union forces captured Lookout Mountain in what became known as the Battle Above the Clouds, because fog shrouded the mountain during the fighting. The next day, November 25th, Grant planned an attack on Missionary Ridge, the main Confederate defensive position. The assault was supposed to be limited, just capturing rifle pits at the base of the ridge. But once Union soldiers took the rifle pits, they kept going, charging up the steep slopes without orders. Officers lost control as thousands of men simply decided to keep attacking. Confederate defenders, shocked by the seemingly suicidal assault, broke and fled. The Army of the Cumberland, humiliated at Chickamauga, redeemed itself at Missionary Ridge. Bragg's army retreated into Georgia, and Chattanooga was secured. The victories at Chattanooga opened Georgia to invasion and positioned Union forces for a campaign toward Atlanta. More importantly, they solidified Grant's reputation as the Union's most effective general. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general, a rank previously held only by George Washington, and gave him command of all Union armies. Grant's strategy for 1864 was simple and brutal. The Union would use its numerical superiority to attack on all fronts simultaneously, preventing the Confederacy from shifting troops to meet different threats. Grant would accompany the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, directing operations against Lee, while General William Tecumseh Sherman led the campaign from Chattanooga toward Atlanta. Other Union forces would advance in Louisiana, the Shenandoah Valley, and along the coast. It would be a war of attrition. Grant understood that the Confederacy was running out of men. Every Confederate soldier killed, wounded, or captured was difficult to replace. The Union, with its much larger population and immigrant arrivals, could replace losses. Grant's plan was to grind down the Confederate armies through constant pressure, accepting heavy Union casualties because he knew the Union could afford them and the Confederacy could not. This approach would make Grant controversial. Critics called him a butcher, saying he wasted lives recklessly. The criticism had some merit. Grant's tactics in Virginia in 1864 led to horrific casualties. But Grant also understood strategic reality. Previous Union commanders had won battles and then stopped, allowing Confederate armies to recover. Grant would not stop. He would keep attacking, keep advancing, until the Confederacy collapsed. The Overland Campaign began in early May 1864 when the Army of the Potomac, about 120,000 strong, crossed the Rapidan River and entered a dense forest called the Wilderness. Lee, with about 65,000 men, attacked on May 5th. The Battle of the Wilderness raged for 2 days in thick woods where visibility was often less than 50 yards. Artillery was largely useless. Fighting was chaotic, close range, and confused. Brush fires started by musket fire burned parts of the forest, incinerating wounded soldiers too injured to escape. Casualties were appalling. Union losses were approximately 17,000. Confederate losses were probably around 11,000, though exact figures are uncertain. By any measure, it was a Union defeat. In past years, after such a battle, Union commanders had retreated. Grant did not retreat. Instead, he ordered the army to move south, trying to get between Lee and Richmond. Lee anticipated the move and got his army into position first, at Spotsylvania Courthouse. From May 8th through May 21st, the armies fought a series of engagements around Spotsylvania, including one of the war's most brutal assaults at a salient in the Confederate line called the Mule Shoe. On May 12th, Union forces attacked in torrential rain, breaking through Confederate defenses. Fighting at a spot called the Bloody Angle continued for nearly 20 hours of hand-to-hand combat. Men bayoneted each other through gaps in log breastworks. Trees were cut down by bullets. Bodies piled so high they had to be moved to clear fields of fire. When Spotsylvania ended, another 30,000 casualties had been added to the butcher's bill, roughly evenly divided. And again, Grant moved south rather than retreating. He sent a dispatch to Washington that captured his determination. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." The armies clashed again at the North Anna River, then at Totopotomoy Creek, then at Cold Harbor. Each time, Lee's army, though outnumbered and suffering irreplaceable losses, managed to construct strong defensive positions. Each time Grant attacked, and each time casualties mounted. Cold Harbor, fought June 1st through June 3rd, 1864, was Grant's worst mistake. Confederate forces had entrenched in strong positions. Grant ordered a massive frontal assault on June 3rd. It was a slaughter reminiscent of Fredericksburg. Union soldiers, knowing they faced near certain death, pinned their names and addresses to their uniforms so their bodies could be identified. In less than an hour, about 7,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded, many in the first 8 minutes of the assault. Confederate casualties were minimal. Grant later wrote that he regretted the assault, one of the few times he admitted a major tactical error. But despite the horrific losses, Grant's strategy was working. In 1 month, from early May to early June, the Army of the Potomac had suffered about 55,000 casualties, more than half Lee's entire army. But Lee had suffered about 33,000 casualties he could not replace. Lee's army was being bled to death. Units that started the campaign at full strength were down to fractions of their original numbers. Officers who had survived 3 years of war were killed or wounded. After Cold Harbor, Grant made another brilliant strategic move. Rather than continuing to batter against Lee's fortifications, he disengaged and moved his entire army south across the James River, threatening Petersburg, a railroad hub south of Richmond. If Petersburg fell, Richmond would be cut off from supplies and would have to be abandoned. Lee rushed forces to Petersburg, and both armies dug in for what would become a 10-month siege. The siege of Petersburg wasn't a siege in the traditional sense of surrounding and starving out a city. Instead, it was a long series of battles, raids, and trench warfare that presaged World War I. Soldiers on both sides lived in elaborate trench systems, enduring constant sniper fire, artillery bombardment, and occasional assaults. The armies tried various tactics to break the stalemate. The most famous was the Battle of the Crater on July 30th, 1864. Union soldiers, many of them Pennsylvania coal miners, dug a tunnel under Confederate fortifications and packed it with 4 tons of gunpowder. The explosion created a crater 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep, killing hundreds of Confederate soldiers and creating a gap in their lines. But the Union assault that followed turned into a disaster. Soldiers poured into the crater rather than around it, becoming trapped. Confederate forces recovered and surrounded the crater, shooting down into it. Black Union troops who had trained specifically for the assault were sent in late and suffered disproportionate casualties. Some black soldiers trying to surrender were murdered by Confederate forces. The battle ended as a Confederate victory with about 4,000 Union casualties compared to about 1,000 Confederate. The siege dragged on through summer and into fall. Meanwhile, other Union campaigns were underway. General Philip Sheridan, an aggressive cavalry commander, was given command of Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley with orders to destroy the valley's ability to supply Lee's army. Sheridan defeated Confederate forces under General Jubal early in battles at Winchester and Fisher's Hill in September, then conducted a campaign of systematic destruction. Sheridan's men burned barns, mills, crops, and anything else that could feed the Confederate war effort. Sheridan reported that a crow flying over the Shenandoah Valley would need to carry its own rations. The destruction was devastating for Valley civilians, but effective in crippling Confederate logistics. The most important campaign of 1864, however, was William Tecumseh Sherman's advance on Atlanta. Sherman, 44 years old, was a restless, brilliant officer who had struggled with depression and accusations of insanity earlier in the war. But Grant trusted him completely, and Sherman had proven himself in Vicksburg and Chattanooga. In early May, Sherman began advancing from Chattanooga toward Atlanta with about 100,000 men in 3 armies. Confederate General Joseph Johnston, commanding about 50 to 60,000 men, fought a masterful defensive campaign, constantly retreating to new positions, avoiding major battles, and forcing Sherman to maneuver rather than simply advancing. For 3 months, the 2 armies engaged in what became a giant chess match across northern Georgia. Sherman would try to flank Johnston's position. Johnston would fall back to another defensive line. Battles were fought at Rocky Face Ridge, Resaca, New Hope Church, and Kennesaw Mountain. Casualties mounted steadily, but Sherman kept pushing south. Jefferson Davis, frustrated with Johnston's constant retreats, replaced him in mid-July with General John Bell Hood. Where Johnston had been cautious, Hood was aggressive to the point of recklessness. Hood immediately attacked Sherman's forces in a series of battles around Atlanta. Peachtree Creek on July 20th, the Battle of Atlanta on July 22nd, and Ezra Church on July 28th. All 3 were Confederate defeats with heavy casualties Hood could not afford. Sherman besieged Atlanta, cutting its railroad connections. On September 1st, Hood evacuated the city to avoid being trapped. Sherman's army marched in on September 2nd, 1864. Sherman sent a telegram to Lincoln, "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won." The capture of Atlanta was a military victory, But more importantly, it was a political turning point. The presidential election of 1864 was approaching, and Lincoln's prospects had looked grim. The war seemed stalemated, casualties were horrific, and many Northerners were war-weary. Democrats had nominated George McClellan on a platform calling the war a failure and advocating a negotiated peace that might have preserved the Confederacy. Lincoln believed he would lose the election. He wrote a memo predicting his defeat and had his cabinet sign it without reading it, planning to cooperate fully with his successor in a last effort to save the Union before the new administration took office. But Atlanta's fall changed everything. Suddenly, Union victory seemed possible, even likely. Sherman's success vindicated Grant's strategy and Lincoln's leadership. In the November election, Lincoln won decisively, carrying all but 3 states and winning 55% of the popular vote. He won overwhelmingly among soldiers voting in the field, a remarkable endorsement considering the suffering they had endured. The election result meant the war would continue until the Confederacy was completely defeated and slavery was completely abolished. There would be no negotiated peace, no compromise that allowed the Confederacy to survive. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman proposed a radical plan. Rather than chase Hood's army, which had moved into northern Alabama and Tennessee, Sherman wanted to march his army across Georgia to the Atlantic coast, cutting a swath of destruction through the Confederacy's heartland. Grant and Lincoln were initially skeptical but eventually agreed. On November 15, 1864, Sherman's army left Atlanta, which they had burned, and began the march to the sea. 62,000 soldiers marched in 2 wings, destroying everything of military value and much that wasn't. Sherman's orders were to live off the land, taking food, livestock, and supplies from Georgia's farms and plantations. His army cut a path roughly 60 miles wide and 300 miles long. The march was psychological warfare. Sherman wanted to demonstrate that the Confederate government could not protect its own citizens, to break the South's will to continue fighting. Soldiers destroyed railroads, heating the rails and twisting them into Sherman's neckties. They burned mills, warehouses, and public buildings. They freed thousands of enslaved people, many of whom followed the army. Destruction was extensive, though Confederate propaganda exaggerated it. Sherman's men generally didn't burn private homes unless fired upon, but they took almost everything of value. For the enslaved people of Georgia, Sherman's march meant liberation. Thousands left plantations and followed the army, seeking freedom and protection. Sherman's attitude toward these refugees was complicated. He saw emancipation as a military necessity to weaken the Confederacy, but he was not an abolitionist in the moral sense, and he worried that large numbers of refugees would slow his army's movement. One tragic incident occurred at Ebenezer Creek in early December when Union General Jefferson C. Davis, not the Confederate president, but a subordinate of Sherman, ordered his engineers to remove pontoon bridges after his troops crossed, stranding hundreds of freed people on the far side with Confederate cavalry approaching. Many drowned trying to cross the swollen creek. The incident outraged abolitionists and highlighted the complex, often callous attitudes even Union officers held toward black refugees. Sherman's army reached Savannah on December 10, 1864. The city was defended by about 10,000 Confederate troops under General William Hardee. Rather than be trapped and besieged, Hardee evacuated across the Savannah River into South Carolina. On December 21st, Sherman entered Savannah. He sent a telegram to Lincoln. "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton." The march to the sea had covered more than 250 miles in roughly 5 weeks. Sherman's army had suffered minimal combat casualties, fewer than 2,000 total. They had destroyed hundreds of miles of railroad, millions of dollars worth of property, and consumed or carried away enormous amounts of food and supplies. More importantly, they had demonstrated that the Confederacy was hollow, that it could not defend its own territory or protect its citizens. Sherman rested his army in Savannah for a few weeks, then in February 1865 began marching north through the Carolinas. This campaign was even more destructive than the Georgia March, particularly in South Carolina, which Union soldiers blamed for starting the war. Columbia, the state capital, burned while Sherman's army was present, with both sides later arguing about who set the fires. Cities, towns, and plantations across the Carolinas faced the same systematic destruction Georgia had endured. Meanwhile, Hood's Confederate Army of Tennessee, which Sherman had left behind in Alabama, launched an invasion of Tennessee in a desperate attempt to draw Sherman away from Georgia. It was a catastrophic decision. Hood's army was badly outnumbered by Union forces under General George Thomas. At the Battle of Franklin on November 30th, 1864, Hood ordered suicidal frontal assaults against entrenched Union positions. The Confederates suffered about 7,000 casualties in a few hours, including 6 generals killed and 6 wounded. It was one of the war's bloodiest disasters. Hood retreated to Nashville, where Thomas methodically assembled overwhelming force. On December 15th and 16th, Thomas attacked and utterly destroyed Hood's army at the Battle of Nashville. The Army of Tennessee, which had fought from Shiloh through Chattanooga and Atlanta, effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Remnants limped back to Mississippi, but they would play no significant role in the war's final months. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Sherman was marching through the Carolinas. Grant had Lee pinned at Petersburg. The Shenandoah Valley was lost. The Mississippi River was under Union control. Confederate armies were melting away through desertion. Civilians were starving. The economy had collapsed, with Confederate money essentially worthless. The blockade had choked off trade. There was no realistic hope of European recognition or intervention. In desperation, the Confederate Congress authorized enlisting enslaved men into the army in March 1865 with the promise of freedom for those who served. This proposal, which Jefferson Davis reluctantly supported, revealed the Confederacy's dire situation. The entire Confederate nation had been built on the premise that slavery was right and necessary, that black people were inferior and suited only for bondage. Now they were preparing to arm enslaved people to save a government dedicated to keeping them enslaved. The absurdity was lost on no one. A few black Confederate companies were organized in Richmond, but the war ended before they saw combat. At Petersburg, Lee's army was starving and shrinking. Desertion accelerated as men received letters from home describing their families' suffering. Lee knew he couldn't hold Petersburg much longer. Grant kept extending his lines westward, stretching Lee's already thin forces to the breaking point. On April 1st, 1865, Union forces under General Philip Sheridan won a decisive victory at Five Forks, cutting the last railroad supplying Petersburg. On April 2nd, Grant ordered a general assault along the Petersburg lines. Confederate defenses, undermanned and exhausted, collapsed in several places. Lee sent a message to Jefferson Davis in Richmond. The army had to evacuate Petersburg, and Richmond could no longer be defended. Davis and the Confederate government fled Richmond that night. Civilians and soldiers who could leave joined the exodus. Warehouses were set afire to deny supplies to the Union. The fires spread, consuming large portions of the city. On April 3rd, 1865, Union troops occupied Richmond. The Confederate capital, which had been the objective of so many failed campaigns, fell with barely a fight. Abraham Lincoln himself visited the city on April 4th, walking through streets where enslaved people, now free, gathered to see him, some falling to their knees. Lincoln told them to kneel only to God. Lee's army, about 30,000 starving, exhausted men, retreated west, hoping to reach North Carolina and join forces with General Joseph Johnston's army, which was trying to stop Sherman's advance. But Grant's forces pursued relentlessly. Sheridan's cavalry harassed Lee's columns, capturing supply trains. Union infantry marched parallel, blocking escape routes. On April 6th at Sailor's Creek, Union forces surrounded and captured nearly 8,000 Confederates, about a quarter of Lee's remaining army. Lee watched the disaster unfold and said, "My God, has the army dissolved?" It nearly had. By April 8th, Lee's army was trapped near a small town called Appomattox Courthouse. Union forces blocked the roads ahead and behind. Lee considered his options. He could attempt to break through Union lines, but that would mean high casualties with little chance of success. He could disperse his army into the countryside to wage guerrilla war, but that would bring untold suffering to civilians and prolong the bloodshed indefinitely. Or he could surrender. On the morning of April 9th, 1865, Lee dressed in his finest uniform, wearing a jeweled sword. He rode to meet Ulysses S. Grant in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house in Appomattox Courthouse. It was a strange coincidence. McLean had owned a farm near Manassas where the war's first major battle had been fought. He had moved to Appomattox to escape the fighting, only to have the war's end literally occur in his living room. Grant arrived in a rumpled, mud-splattered uniform, looking more like a private than a commanding general. The two men, who had both served in the Mexican War years before, exchanged polite small talk. Then they discussed terms. Grant's conditions were generous. Confederate soldiers would surrender their weapons and return home, not to be disturbed by United States authority so long as they observed their paroles and obeyed the law. Officers could keep their sidearms and personal property. And because Lee mentioned that many of his soldiers owned their horses, Grant agreed that any man claiming a horse or mule could take it home for spring planting. Lee signed the surrender documents. Grant introduced him to his staff officers, including General Ely Parker, a Seneca man who had drafted the final surrender document. According to one account, Lee looked at Parker and said, "I am glad to see one real American here." Parker reportedly replied, "We are all Americans." Whether this exchange actually occurred is disputed, but it captured a truth about the war. It was Americans killing Americans, and now Americans would have to rebuild together. News of Lee's surrender spread quickly. Union soldiers celebrated while Confederate soldiers wept. Some broke their rifles rather than hand them over. Others simply felt relief that the fighting was over. Grant ordered his men not to celebrate too loudly, saying, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." On April 12th, Confederate soldiers formally surrendered their arms and flags in a ceremony where Union General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top, ordered his men to salute the defeated Confederates as they passed. It was a gesture of respect for brave enemies who were now fellow citizens again. Lee's surrender effectively ended the war, though several other Confederate armies remained in the field. Johnston surrendered to Sherman in North Carolina on April 26, 1865, after negotiations complicated by Sherman offering terms that were too generous politically and had to be revised. Other Confederate forces surrendered throughout May and into June. The last Confederate general to surrender was Stand Watie, a Cherokee leader who held out until June 23, 1865. Jefferson Davis was captured in Georgia on May 10th and imprisoned for 2 years before being released. But the joy of Union victory was shattered on April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Appomattox. President Lincoln and his wife, Mary, attended a performance of a comedy called Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington. Lincoln's bodyguard left his post to watch the play. During the third act, at about 10:15 in the evening, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer, entered the presidential box. Booth shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a Derringer pistol, then stabbed Major Henry Rathbone, who was also in the box. Booth leapt to the stage, catching his spur on a flag and breaking his leg in the fall. He shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants," Virginia's state motto, and fled through the back of the theater. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He was carried across the street to the Peterson house, where doctors tried to save him. But the bullet had penetrated his brain, and there was no hope. Cabinet members and military officers gathered through the night. At 7:22 on the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had often quarreled with Lincoln but admired him deeply, said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Booth's assassination of Lincoln was part of a larger conspiracy to decapitate the Union government. Co-conspirator Lewis Powell attacked Secretary of State William Seward at his home the same night, seriously wounding him but failing to kill him. Another conspirator was supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but lost his nerve and fled. Booth himself escaped into Maryland and Virginia, but was cornered in a tobacco barn on April 26th. He refused to surrender and was shot, dying hours later. 8 conspirators were arrested, tried by military commission, and convicted. 4, including Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the federal government, were hanged on July 7, 1865. 3 others received life sentences. 1 received a 6-year sentence. The trials were controversial, with questions about whether the military commission had proper jurisdiction and whether all defendants received fair treatment. Lincoln's assassination was a catastrophe for the South and for the freed people. Lincoln had advocated a moderate approach to Reconstruction, summarized in his second inaugural address a month before his death. He had called for malice toward none, charity for all, and proposed to bind up the nation's wounds. His plan for Reconstruction would have been relatively lenient toward former Confederates while still securing freedom for the formerly enslaved. Vice President Andrew Johnson, who now became president, was a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union. He was also a crude, stubborn man with little sympathy for black rights. He opposed slavery, but believed in white supremacy. His approach to Reconstruction would be even more lenient toward former Confederates and far less protective of freed people than Lincoln's likely would have been. The war was over, but the struggle for what kind of nation would emerge from the war's ashes was just beginning, and that struggle would shape America for generations. The casualties of the Civil War were staggering and remain difficult to fully comprehend. The traditional estimate of about 620,000 deaths has been revised upward by recent scholarship, with some historians now suggesting the true number may have been 750,000 or more. To put this in perspective, the United States population in 1860 was about 31 million. The war killed roughly 2 to 2.5% of the entire population. These were not just numbers in ledgers. They were fathers and sons, husbands and brothers. They were young men who would never marry, never have children, never see their homes again. They were farmers and clerks, blacksmiths and teachers, rich men and poor, volunteer soldiers and conscripts. About 365,000 Union soldiers died, roughly 110,000 in combat, and the rest from disease. About 260,000 Confederate soldiers died, perhaps 95,000 in combat, and the rest from disease, though Confederate records are incomplete, and the true number may be higher. Disease killed more soldiers than bullets. Armies of the 1860s lacked understanding of germ theory. Camps were unsanitary. Water supplies were contaminated. Soldiers lived in close quarters where diseases spread rapidly. Dysentery, Typhoid, measles, smallpox, and pneumonia ravaged both armies. Field hospitals were places of horror where amputations were performed without anesthesia or antiseptic techniques. Infection killed many who survived initial wounds. The war also killed or displaced countless civilians, though exact numbers will never be known. Families starved. Homes were destroyed. Cities burned. Enslaved people died in the chaos of liberation, from disease, violence, and the dislocations of suddenly becoming refugees. The war destroyed billions of dollars in property and left entire regions economically devastated for decades. Beyond the dead, hundreds of thousands more were maimed or psychologically scarred. Amputees, men with shattered bodies and minds, filled veterans' homes for the rest of their lives. Many suffered what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, but was then called soldier's heart, or simply not understood at all. Morphine addiction was common among veterans who had been treated with the drug for pain. Families were torn apart in border states and divided communities. Brothers fought on opposite sides. Fathers disowned sons. Friendships ended. Some of these rifts healed over time, but many never did. The war left a legacy of bitterness that would endure for generations, particularly in the South where defeat, occupation, and the loss of slavery created a sense of grievance that was cultivated and remembered. But the war also ended slavery, the great moral stain on American democracy. 4 million people who had been legally considered property were free. The magnitude of this transformation cannot be overstated. People who had been whipped, bought, sold, and worked without compensation now had legal personhood. Families that had been torn apart could try to reunite. Children could learn to read without risking brutal punishment. People could negotiate for wages, choose where to live, and make decisions about their own lives. The transition from slavery to freedom was neither easy nor complete. Freedom did not bring equality, economic security, or even physical safety. But it was freedom nonetheless, and the formerly enslaved understood its value even when white Americans, North and South, tried to limit it. Years immediately following the war are known as the Reconstruction era, lasting roughly from 1865 to 1877. This period was as consequential as the war itself in many ways, determining what the Union victory would actually mean. Would the freed people become full citizens with political and economic rights? Would the former Confederate states face real consequences for rebellion? Would the federal government protect black Southerners from violence and discrimination? These questions were fiercely contested, and the answers would disappoint the hopes of those who believed the war had truly created a new birth of freedom. Andrew Johnson's approach to Reconstruction, called Presidential Reconstruction, was lenient toward former Confederates. He issued pardons freely to those who took loyalty oaths, allowing former Confederate officials and military officers to return to power in Southern states. He did require Southern states to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and to repudiate Confederate war debts. But he made no effort to protect freed people's rights or to ensure they could vote. Southern states under Johnson's plan quickly organized new governments dominated by former Confederates. By late 1865, these reconstructed state governments began passing laws called Black Codes. These laws varied by state, but shared a common purpose: to restrict the freedom of black people and force them back into conditions as close to slavery as possible without technically violating the 13th Amendment. The Black Codes were breathtakingly comprehensive in their efforts to control black lives. In Mississippi, one of the harshest examples, black people were required to have written evidence of employment for the coming year every January. Those without such proof could be arrested for vagrancy and fined. If they couldn't pay the fine, they could be hired out to white employers who would pay the fine in exchange for their labor. This was essentially slavery under a different name. South Carolina's black codes required black people who wanted to work in any occupation other than farmer or servant to pay special taxes that were prohibitively expensive. This ensured most would remain agricultural laborers. The codes restricted where black people could live, travel, and own property. They established curfews. They prohibited black people from owning firearms. They created separate court systems with different punishments for black and white defendants. The codes also bound black children to white employers through apprenticeship laws. County courts could declare black children orphans if their parents were deemed unable to support them, then assign the children to white employers, often their former enslavers. These apprentices worked without pay until age 21 for men or 18 for women, receiving only minimal food, clothing, and shelter. Marriage laws presented another mechanism of control. The codes legally recognized marriages between black people for the first time, but also created harsh penalties for adultery and interracial marriage. These laws served multiple purposes, encouraging stable families to keep the black labor force reproducing, but also providing another avenue for criminal charges that could lead to forced labor. Vagrancy laws were particularly pernicious. They defined vagrancy so broadly that almost any black person could be arrested. Being unemployed was vagrancy. Loitering was vagrancy. Spending money injudiciously was vagrancy. Conviction meant fines and imprisonment, and prisoners were leased out to private employers as convict laborers. This began the convict lease system that would become one of the post-war South's most brutal institutions. Violence enforced these legal restrictions. White Southerners formed organizations to terrorize black people and their white Republican allies. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in Tennessee in late 1865 or early 1866, began as a social club but quickly evolved into a terrorist organization. Klansmen wore white robes and hoods to hide their identities. They conducted nighttime raids, burning homes and schools, beating and murdering black people and white Republicans. The violence was systematic and had clear political purposes. Klansmen targeted black people who tried to vote, who were economically successful, who educated themselves, or who in any way challenged white supremacy. They targeted white Republicans, teachers at schools for black children, and agents of the Freedmen's Bureau. The goal was to restore white democratic control and keep black people subordinate. When reports of the black codes and the violence reached Washington, radical Republicans in Congress were outraged. They refused to seat the congressmen and senators elected by Johnson's reconstructed Southern governments. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 over Johnson's veto, declaring that all persons born in the United States were citizens with equal rights under law, regardless of race. This was the first time the federal government had defined citizenship and asserted authority to protect civil rights. But a law could be repealed by a future Congress. To make these protections permanent, Congress drafted the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Proposed in June 1866 and ratified in July 1868, the 14th Amendment revolutionized American constitutional law. The amendment's first section defined citizenship. All persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens of the United States and of the state where they resided. This overturned the Dred Scott decision and guaranteed citizenship to the formerly enslaved. The amendment then prohibited states from abridging the privileges or immunities of citizens, from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and from denying any person equal protection of the laws. These were sweeping principles that would, over time, fundamentally change the relationship between individuals and government. The amendment applied the Bill of Rights to state governments, not just the federal government. It promised equal protection, though what that meant in practice would be contested for more than a century. The amendment gave the federal government power to protect individual rights against state infringement, a revolutionary expansion of federal authority. The 14th Amendment also addressed Reconstruction politics. It reduced a state's representation in Congress if it denied voting rights to male citizens, providing an incentive for Southern states to allow black men to vote. It barred former Confederate officials who had previously sworn oaths to support the Constitution from holding federal or state office unless Congress removed the disability by a two-thirds vote. This was meant to keep unrepentant Confederates out of power, though Congress later amnestied most of them. Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment and encouraged Southern states to reject it. 10 of the 11 former Confederate states initially refused to ratify it. This rejection, combined with ongoing violence in the South and Johnson's continued obstruction of Republican policies, led to a complete break between the President and Congress. In the 1866 midterm elections, Republicans won overwhelming majorities in both houses of Congress, giving them the two-thirds needed to override presidential vetoes. They now had the power to implement their vision of Reconstruction over Johnson's objections. In March 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, beginning what's known as Radical Reconstruction or Congressional Reconstruction. The Reconstruction Acts divided the 10 Southern states that had refused to ratify the 14th Amendment into 5 military districts, each commanded by a Union general. The military would maintain order, protect civil rights, and oversee the creation of new state governments. To be readmitted to the Union and have military rule ended, states had to write new constitutions guaranteeing black men the right to vote, elect new governments under those constitutions, ratify the 14th Amendment, and have those new constitutions approved by Congress. This was revolutionary. For the first time, the federal government mandated black male suffrage as a condition of statehood. Black men would vote alongside white men in elections to constitutional conventions and in ratifying the new constitutions. Black men could run for office. The Southern political order was being remade from the ground up. The Reconstruction Acts transformed Southern politics overnight. Black men, finally able to vote, participated in extraordinary numbers. In many areas, they formed the majority of voters. They joined the Republican Party, which had freed them and was fighting for their rights. White Republicans, called scalawags by their opponents, also supported Reconstruction. Northern whites who moved south after the war, called carpetbaggers, added to the Republican coalition. Between 1868 and 1870, new constitutions were written and ratified in the former Confederate states. These constitutions were the most progressive the South had ever seen. They guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. They established public school systems, something most Southern states had lacked. They reformed tax codes to be more equitable. They funded internal improvements like railroads and roads. They guaranteed a degree of civil and political equality unprecedented in the South. Elections under these new constitutions brought multiracial governments to power. Black men were elected to every level of office. 14 black men served in the U.S. House of Representatives during Reconstruction. Who served in the U.S. Senate? Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, both from Mississippi. Hundreds served in state legislatures. Others became lieutenant governors, state treasurers, secretaries of state, and local officials. These black officials were remarkably qualified. Many had been free before the war and were educated. Some had served in the Union Army. They included ministers, teachers, businessmen, and farmers. They brought diverse perspectives, but shared a commitment to building a more just South. They pushed for public education, land reform, and civil rights protections. They worked alongside white Republicans to create the social infrastructure the South desperately needed. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in March 1865, played a crucial role during Reconstruction. Officially the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, it was a federal agency charged with helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. The Bureau distributed food and medical care to destitute Southerners, both black and white. It established schools and helped fund teachers. It legalized marriages that had been informal under slavery. It mediated labor disputes between freed people and employers. It helped families reunite and search for members sold away during slavery. The Bureau's educational efforts were particularly important. During slavery, teaching enslaved people to read had been illegal in most southern states. Freedom brought an intense hunger for education. Black communities pooled resources to build schools. Northern missionary societies sent teachers south. The Bureau coordinated these efforts and provided funding. By 1870, there were more than 4,000 schools serving over 200,000 black students across the South. Adults attended school alongside children, learning to read and write for the first time in their 60s and 70s. The schools faced constant resistance. White supremacists burned school buildings, threatened teachers, and attacked students. But the schools persisted, creating the first generation of black Southerners who could read contracts, vote knowledgeably, and advocate for themselves in ways previously impossible. Higher education also expanded. Black colleges and universities were founded during and immediately after Reconstruction, including Howard University, Fisk University, and Atlanta University, among many others. These institutions trained teachers, ministers, doctors, and lawyers who would serve black communities for generations. Economic Reconstruction was more complicated and ultimately less successful than political Reconstruction. The formerly enslaved wanted land. They had worked the land for generations without compensation. Many believed, with some justification, that the federal government would redistribute plantation land to them. 40 acres and a mule became a symbol of this hope, based on General Sherman's Special Field Order 15 in January 1865, which set aside coastal land in Georgia and South Carolina for black settlement and authorized the Army to loan mules to the settlers. But Andrew Johnson reversed Sherman's order, returning the land to former Confederate owners. Congress debated various land redistribution plans, but none passed. The radical Republicans, despite their commitment to black political rights, included many who believed deeply in the sanctity of property rights, even Confederate property. Some argued that freed people should purchase land on the open market, ignoring the fact that people who had been enslaved had no money to buy land. Without land, most freed people had no choice but to work for white landowners, but they refused to work in gangs under overseers as they had under slavery. They insisted on family autonomy, on working their own plots rather than laboring collectively. This led to the development of sharecropping, a system where black families farmed plots of land owned by whites, paying rent with a share of the crop, typically half. Sharecropping was better than slavery. Families worked together without overseers constantly supervising, but it was far from true economic freedom. Landowners controlled the credit system, providing supplies and food at inflated prices through plantation stores. At harvest time, the landowner would settle accounts, deducting the costs of supplies, rent, and interest. Almost invariably, sharecroppers ended the year in debt, legally bound to keep working the land until they paid off debts they could never escape. The system trapped families in generational poverty. It created a new form of economic bondage that lasted well into the 20th century. Some freed people managed to purchase land and achieve genuine independence, but they were the minority. Most remained tied to the land they worked, but did not own, subject to white economic control, even if they now had nominal political rights. The 15th Amendment, proposed in February 1869 and ratified in March 1870, was the last of the Reconstruction amendments. It prohibited federal and state governments from denying citizens the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The amendment aimed to protect black voting rights permanently, preventing states from reimposing the kinds of restrictions that had existed before Reconstruction. But the amendment had significant limitations. It only addressed race-based restrictions. States could still impose other voting requirements: literacy tests, poll taxes, property qualifications, residency requirements. As long as these were race-neutral on their face, they didn't violate the 15th Amendment. Southern states would exploit these loopholes ruthlessly in later decades to disenfranchise black voters without explicitly violating the amendment. The amendment also said nothing about holding office, about jury service, about social equality, or about many other aspects of citizenship. And critically, it provided no robust enforcement mechanism. It relied on federal willingness to intervene when states violated it, a willingness that would erode in the 1870s. Reconstruction governments faced enormous challenges. They had to rebuild Southern infrastructure destroyed by the war. They had to create public services that had barely existed before. They had to do this with limited tax revenue because the war had destroyed much of the South's wealth. They had to navigate intense opposition from white Democrats who viewed the entire enterprise as illegitimate. Southern Democrats waged a campaign of propaganda and violence to overthrow Reconstruction governments. They called the governments corrupt and incompetent, claiming that black people were unfit to participate in politics and that outside agitators were manipulating them. While some Reconstruction officials were indeed corrupt, corruption was not remotely unique to these governments. Previous, all-white Southern governments had been deeply corrupt, as were many Northern governments during this period. Reconstruction governments were actually remarkably honest given the circumstances. White Democrats organized as the Conservative or Democratic Party, depending on the state. They used violence and intimidation systematically to suppress black voting. The Ku Klux Klan and similar groups like the White League and the Red Shirts conducted campaigns of terror. They murdered black office holders and voters. They attacked Republican campaign events. They forced black workers to vote Democratic or lose their jobs. They stuffed ballot boxes and used fraud when intimidation wasn't sufficient. The violence reached such levels that Congress passed enforcement acts in 1870 and 1871, making it a federal crime to interfere with voting rights and allowing the president to use military force and suspend habeas corpus to combat terrorist organizations. President Ulysses S. Grant, who had won the presidency in 1868, used these powers to break up the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina and elsewhere. For a few years in the early 1870s, federal intervention provided some protection for black voters and Republican governments. But Northern support for Reconstruction was weakening. Many white Northerners had never been committed to racial equality. They had supported the war to preserve the Union and ended slavery to weaken the Confederacy, not out of deep commitment to black rights. As the 1870s progressed, they grew tired of the political conflict, the continued federal intervention in Southern states, and the ongoing expense. Northern voters faced their own economic and political concerns. The Panic of 1873 triggered a severe economic depression. Labor conflicts intensified as workers struck for better conditions. Political scandals rocked the Grant administration, though Grant himself was honest. Democrats made gains in Northern elections, including winning control of the House of Representatives in 1874. The Supreme Court further undermined Reconstruction. In a series of decisions, the court interpreted the 14th and 15th Amendments narrowly, limiting federal power to protect civil rights. In the slaughterhouse cases of 1873, the court ruled that the 14th Amendment protected only a narrow set of rights related to national citizenship, not the broader rights of state citizenship. In United States v. Cruikshank in 1876, the court ruled that the 14th Amendment prohibited only state discrimination, not private discrimination, making it nearly impossible to prosecute Klan violence as a federal crime. These decisions, ostensibly about federalism and constitutional interpretation, gutted federal power to protect black Southerners. They meant that state and local governments could allow private violence against black citizens without federal intervention. They previewed the legal reasoning that would sustain segregation and discrimination for the next century. One by one, Southern states fell back under Democratic control, a process white Southerners called redemption. Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee had Democratic governments by 1870. Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Arkansas, and Mississippi followed by 1876. South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana remained under Republican control only because of federal troops maintaining order. The presidential election of 1876 turned into a constitutional crisis that ended Reconstruction. Democrat Samuel Tilden won the popular vote against Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, but 20 electoral votes were disputed, all from southern states plus Oregon. Competing election returns claimed different results. The outcome depended on which returns were certified. Congress created an electoral commission to resolve the dispute. The commission voted along party lines, awarding all disputed electoral votes to Hayes, giving him a one-vote electoral college victory. Democrats threatened to filibuster, preventing Hayes from taking office. The crisis threatened to reignite civil conflict. Behind closed doors, Republican and Democratic leaders negotiated what became known as the Compromise of 1877. The exact terms were never written down and remain somewhat disputed by historians, but the essential bargain was clear. Democrats would allow Hayes to become president without further obstruction. In exchange, Hayes would withdraw the remaining federal troops from the South, ending military reconstruction. He would also appoint at least one Southern Democrat to his cabinet, support federal funding for Southern internal improvements like railroads, and generally adopt a conciliatory policy toward the South. Hayes was inaugurated in March 1877. In April, he ordered federal troops withdrawn from the South Carolina and Louisiana statehouses where they had been protecting Republican governments. Without military support, those governments immediately fell. Democrats took control. Reconstruction was over. The Compromise of 1877 was a political solution to an electoral crisis, but it was a catastrophe for black Southerners and for the ideals the war had supposedly been fought to achieve. The federal government essentially abandoned millions of black citizens to the mercy of white Southerners who had never accepted their freedom or equality. The promise of Reconstruction, the possibility of a genuinely multiracial democracy in the South, was betrayed. What followed was the systematic destruction of black political power and the creation of a comprehensive system of racial oppression that would last nearly a century. This era is known as the Jim Crow period, named after a minstrel show character that mocked black people. Jim Crow was not just a set of laws, but an entire social system built on white supremacy and black subordination. The process of disenfranchising black voters began almost immediately after redemption. Southern states couldn't explicitly deny voting rights based on race because of the 15th Amendment, so they used indirect methods. They imposed poll taxes, requiring voters to pay a fee that many poor people, black and white, couldn't afford. They enacted literacy tests, requiring voters to read and interpret sections of the state constitution to the satisfaction of white registrars who could pass or fail anyone arbitrarily. They created complicated registration requirements and limited the times and places registration could occur. Some states used grandfather clauses, which exempted from these requirements anyone whose grandfather had been eligible to vote before the Civil War. This allowed poor and illiterate white men to vote while excluding almost all black men. Other states used understanding clauses, requiring voters to demonstrate understanding of constitutional provisions, again giving white registrars complete discretion to pass white applicants and fail black ones. The Democratic Party in the South held white primaries where only white voters could participate in selecting Democratic candidates. Since Democrats won virtually all general elections in the solidly Democratic South, the primary was the only election that mattered. Excluding black voters from primaries effectively excluded them from political power. These methods were devastatingly effective. In Louisiana, about 130,000 black men were registered to vote in 1896. By 1904, after new voter restrictions, only about 1,340 were registered. In Alabama, about 180,000 black men were registered in 1890. By 1902, only about 3,000 remained on the rolls. Across the South, black voting dropped from hundreds of thousands to handfuls. With black voters removed from the electorate and Republican opposition eliminated, white Democrats consolidated complete control. They enacted comprehensive Jim Crow laws segregating every aspect of public life. Separate schools, separate railroad cars, separate waiting rooms, separate water fountains, separate restrooms, separate sections of restaurants and theaters when black people were allowed in at all, separate Bibles for swearing in court, separate phone booths, separate elevators. The segregation was exhaustive and exhausting, a constant reminder that white society considered black people inferior and unwelcome. The laws claimed to provide separate but equal facilities, a doctrine the Supreme Court endorsed in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. A black man named Homer Plessy had challenged Louisiana's railroad segregation law, arguing it violated the 14th Amendment. The court ruled 7-1 that segregation was constitutional as long as facilities were equal. In practice, of course, they never were. Black schools received a fraction of the funding white schools did. Black facilities were uniformly inferior when they existed at all. Jim Crow was enforced not just by law but by terror. Lynching became a common tool of racial control. Between 1877 and 1950, nearly 4,000 documented lynchings of black people occurred in the South, though the true number was certainly higher. Lynching was public torture and murder, often committed by mobs in front of crowds that included women and children. The bodies were sometimes burned, mutilated, or displayed as warnings. Victims were lynched for alleged crimes, for violating racial etiquette, for economic success, or for no reason at all. A black man could be lynched for being accused of looking at a white woman wrong, for being too prosperous, for not showing sufficient deference, or simply because a mob felt like it. The alleged offense was almost always trivial or fabricated. The real purpose was to maintain white supremacy through terror. Or enforcement rarely intervened. Lynchers were almost never prosecuted. When prosecutions did occur, all white juries refused to convict. Newspapers published advance notice of lynchings, and special trains brought spectators. Photographers took pictures that were sold as postcards. The savagery was brazen and public, a demonstration that black lives had no protection under law. Economic oppression completed the system. Most black Southerners remained trapped in sharecropping and tenant farming. Those who managed to buy land or achieve success faced violence and intimidation. Black businesses served segregated markets with limited opportunities for growth. Black workers were relegated to the lowest-paying jobs. When labor unions organized, They typically excluded black workers or segregated them into powerless auxiliaries. Convict leasing became a major source of labor and revenue for Southern states. Black men were arrested on trivial or fabricated charges, convicted in sham trials, and leased to private companies for labor. They worked in mines, built railroads, cleared swamps, and performed other dangerous work under conditions that were in many ways worse than slavery. At least enslaved people had value to their enslavers and some incentive to keep them alive. Convict lessees had no such incentive. Workers who died could simply be replaced by new arrests. Mortality rates in convict lease camps were horrific. This entire system was built on the ruins of Reconstruction, on the failure of the federal government to protect the rights it had ostensibly guaranteed in constitutional amendments. The failure was political, moral, and constitutional. It demonstrated that without sustained federal will to enforce civil rights, those rights could be systematically destroyed by determined local resistance. But the betrayal of Reconstruction wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. The North complied with and enabled it. Northern Democrats supported their Southern counterparts. Northern Republicans abandoned black Southerners to focus on other issues. Northern businesses invested in the segregated South and profited from cheap, exploited labor. The federal government appointed segregationists to office and enforced discriminatory policies in its own institutions. The narrative that prevailed in both North and South by the early 1900s was the lost cause mythology. This was a romanticized version of the Confederacy and the war that was factually wrong but culturally powerful. The lost cause portrayed the Confederacy as a noble effort to defend states' rights and Southern culture against Northern aggression. It minimized or denied slavery's central role in causing the war. It portrayed enslaved people as happy and loyal, slavery as benevolent, and Reconstruction as a corrupt disaster imposed by vindictive Northerners and their ignorant black allies. The lost cause was promoted through books, speeches, monuments, and popular culture. Organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy worked to shape school curricula and public memory. Confederate monuments were erected across the South, and even in some northern cities, particularly during the Jim Crow era and again during the Civil Rights Movement, as symbols of white supremacy rather than simple historical commemoration. Films like The Birth of a Nation, released in 1915, brought lost cause mythology to mass audiences through new cinema technology. The film portrayed Reconstruction as a nightmare of black rule and the Ku Klux Klan as heroes saving white civilization. It was shown in the White House to President Woodrow Wilson, a Southerner who had resegregated federal agencies. The film's impact was enormous, shaping popular understanding of the war and Reconstruction for generations. History textbooks adopted lost cause interpretations. Students across the country, not just in the South, learned that the war was about states' rights, that slavery was incidental, that Reconstruction was a terrible mistake, and that segregation was natural and appropriate. This version of history provided ideological justification for Jim Crow and reconciled white Northerners and Southerners at the expense of black Americans whose experiences and perspectives were erased. The Civil War's true legacy was thus complicated and contested. The war had preserved the Union and ended slavery, achievements of immense importance. 4 million people gained their freedom. The principle that states could not unilaterally secede was established. The federal government's power to protect individual rights was expanded, at least on paper. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments transformed the Constitution, creating the legal foundation for civil rights even if those rights were not immediately realized. But the promise of equality was deferred. Black Americans faced another century of systematic oppression before the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s began to dismantle Jim Crow. The 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection and the 15th Amendment's protection of voting rights remained largely dead letters in the South until federal intervention in the 1960s finally enforced them. The war also left lasting scars. Families on both sides mourned sons, fathers, and brothers who never came home. Regional divisions and resentments persisted. Economic gaps between North and South, already significant before the war, widened. The South remained predominantly agricultural and poor, while the North industrialized and prospered. This divergence would take more than a century to substantially close. For Black Americans, the Civil War and its aftermath represented both liberation and betrayal. Slavery ended, which was revolutionary. The possibility of citizenship and equality was glimpsed during Reconstruction, but the promise was not fulfilled. The generation of Black Americans who lived through slavery, emancipation, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow experienced the full arc of hope and disappointment. They had been freed but not truly liberated, granted rights on paper that were denied in practice, promised equality that was systematically withheld. Still, Black Americans never stopped fighting for their rights. Throughout the Jim Crow era, they built institutions, educated their children, formed organizations, and challenged oppression. The NAACP, founded in 1909, began the long legal campaign against segregation. Black churches, schools, and businesses created spaces of autonomy and dignity within a hostile society. Black intellectuals, artists, and activists kept alive the vision of true equality. The Civil War's impact extended beyond race relations and Reconstruction politics. The war accelerated industrialization and economic modernization, particularly in the North. The demands of warfare spurred technological innovation in weapons, transportation, communication, and medicine. The war brought new roles for women who served as nurses, ran farms and businesses while men fought, and in some cases even disguised themselves as men to enlist as soldiers. The war expanded federal power in ways that permanently changed American government. Before the war, the federal government had been relatively small and limited in its functions. The war required massive expansion, raising armies, financing enormous expenses, providing for war widows and disabled veterans, and eventually overseeing Reconstruction. Federal authority over state and local governments increased dramatically, a trend that would continue in later crises. The war also influenced American culture and identity. It became the central event in American history, the moment when the nation's fundamental values were tested and, in some sense, redefined. The war's literature, from personal memoirs to great novels, shaped how Americans understood heroism, sacrifice, and national identity. The battlefields became sites of pilgrimage and memory. Veterans' reunions, eventually including both Union and Confederate soldiers in gestures of reconciliation, reinforced a shared national narrative, even as that narrative often obscured the war's causes and consequences. For the world beyond America, the Civil War demonstrated that democratic republics could survive internal crises and civil conflicts. European monarchists had predicted that American democracy would collapse, that popular government was inherently unstable. The Union's survival and victory suggested otherwise. The war also contributed to the global movement against slavery, though slavery persisted in parts of Latin America and other regions for decades longer. The military lessons of the Civil War influenced warfare globally. European military observers studied the campaigns and battles. The use of railroads for troop movement, telegraphs for communication, and trenches for defense presaged elements of World War I. The scale of mobilization and the concept of total war, particularly Sherman's campaigns, influenced military thinking about how modern wars would be fought. As the 19th century ended and the 20th began, Civil War veterans were aging. The last great reunion occurred in 1913 at Gettysburg's 50th anniversary, where thousands of elderly men in blue and grey shook hands across the stone wall where Pickett's men had charged decades before. The image was powerful and moving, symbolizing national reconciliation. But notably absent from these reunions were black veterans and the question of what the war had actually been about. The last verified Union veteran, Albert Wilson, died in 1956. The last verified Confederate veteran, Pleasant Crump, died in 1951, though several others claim to have served and lived later. With their deaths, living memory of the war ended, but its legacy continued. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century was, in many ways, the second attempt to complete Reconstruction's unfinished business. The same questions that had been contested in the 1860s and 70s returned. Would black Americans enjoy full citizenship and equality? Would the federal government protect their rights against state and local opposition? Would constitutional amendments guaranteeing equality be enforced? The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 finally gave legal force to principles that had been enshrined in constitutional amendments a century earlier. Federal intervention, similar to Reconstruction's military occupation, was necessary to desegregate schools, protect voters, and combat discrimination. The parallels were striking and intentional. Civil rights activists saw themselves as completing the work that Reconstruction had begun. Even today, the Civil War's legacy shapes American society. Debates about Confederate symbols and monuments reflect ongoing disagreements about how to remember the war and what it represented. Arguments about federal versus state power, about voting rights and their protection, about racial equality and justice, all echo conflicts that the war and Reconstruction addressed but did not fully resolve. The war killed more than 600,000 Americans, probably closer to 750,000, and devastated much of the South. It ended slavery, preserving the Union in the process. It expanded federal power and constitutional protections for individual rights. It demonstrated the possibilities and limits of revolutionary change in American society. It revealed both the nobility of which humans are capable, the willingness to sacrifice for principle and country, and the depths of cruelty, the willingness to enslave, oppress, and kill. Understanding the Civil War requires understanding not just the battles and generals, the strategies and campaigns, but the broader context of what was being fought for and what was achieved. It requires grappling with the fact that a nation founded on principles of liberty maintained slavery for 80 years. It requires recognizing that ending slavery required catastrophic violence, that moral progress often comes at terrible cost. It requires acknowledging that military victory did not automatically translate to social justice, that winning the war did not ensure winning the peace. The Civil War was America's defining crisis, the moment when the nation faced the fundamental contradiction between its ideals and its practices, and resolved it, partially, through violence. The resolution was incomplete. The work begun in the war and Reconstruction continues. The Constitution was amended to guarantee equality, but achieving actual equality has required sustained effort across generations. The war settled that the United States would remain one nation and that slavery would end. But it could not, by itself, create the more perfect union that Lincoln envisioned in the Gettysburg Address. Tonight, we have traced this long, complex story from its origins in colonial slavery through the growing sectional crisis, into the war itself with its battles and strategies, its suffering and sacrifice, and finally through Reconstruction's promise and failure into the Jim Crow era and beyond. We have seen how economic systems, political compromises, and moral failures created the conditions for war. We have followed armies across battlefields from Bull Run to Appomattox. We have witnessed emancipation and the brief flowering of multiracial democracy during Reconstruction. And we have seen how that promise was betrayed, leading to another century of struggle. The story of the American Civil War is not a simple narrative of good versus evil, though slavery was undeniably evil and its abolition undeniably good. It is a story of a nation divided against itself, of people on all sides who believed they were fighting for justice and freedom, even when they were defending injustice and bondage. It is a story of remarkable courage and appalling cruelty, of soaring idealism and base prejudice, of revolutionary change and stubborn continuity. More than 160 years after the war ended, its echoes still resonate. The nation it preserved continues. The freedom it brought, however imperfectly realized, changed millions of lives and their descendants. The constitutional amendments it produced provide the legal foundation for ongoing struggles for equality and justice. The questions it raised about federal power, states' rights, racial justice, and national identity remain relevant. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let this history settle in your mind. The names and dates, the battles and speeches, the triumphs and tragedies. Remember the soldiers in blue and grey who marched into cannon fire believing in their cause. Remember the enslaved people who seized freedom when Union armies approached, who built new lives from the ruins of bondage. Remember the politicians and activists who fought to expand rights and those who fought to restrict them. Remember that history is made by human choices, by people deciding what they value and what they will sacrifice for those values. The Civil War shaped the nation we live in today. Its legacy is everywhere if you know how to look for it. Understanding this history helps us understand ourselves, our country, and the ongoing work of creating a more just society. The war answered some questions definitively. The Union would not be dissolved, and slavery would not continue. But it left others for future generations to resolve, questions we are still working through today. So as the story of the American Civil War comes to a close for tonight, rest well in the knowledge that you have journeyed through one of history's most consequential chapters. You have learned about the complexities of the past, the difficult choices people faced, and the consequences of those choices that rippled across generations. Let this knowledge enrich your understanding, inform your perspective, and perhaps inspire you to learn even more. If you enjoyed this deep exploration of Civil War history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Library channel. There are many more stories to explore together, many more histories to uncover in the same calm, thorough way we have examined this one. Share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of the Civil War most interests you? What questions do you still have? What other historical topics would you like to explore? Thank you for spending this time learning together. Thank you for your curiosity about the past and your patience with a story that demanded to be told in full with all its complexity and all its importance. May the history of those who came before inform the choices we make today. May their sacrifices, their struggles, and their hopes guide us toward a more perfect union. Sleep well, and remember that understanding our history is the first step toward shaping our future. Good night from the Midnight Library.